Hello everyone, Communicare Prevention Team is welcoming you back to join us in learning about the dangers of prescription drugs and how it affects your body. When prescription medications are taken as prescribed by a doctor for an illness, they may be mistakenly thought of as being safe or harmless. However, when these medications are not taken as prescribed, they are not safe. Commonly abused prescription drugs, including pain relievers, sedatives, stimulants, and tranquilizers, are highly addictive. Let's explore the pathways of opioid addiction and epidemic by learning the severe side effects when abused and the negative health consequences that leads to addiction and even death.
Alright everybody, and welcome back. This is our third presentation and our fifth video altogether for Communicare Substance Abuse Prevention Services based out of Oxford, Mississippi, serving Region 2 of Northern Mississippi. I am Charles Dingus, and at the beginning was my excellent supervisor, Ms. Shanterrica Pegues. In this fifth video, we are actually going to be focusing on opioid pain prescription, medication, and the opioid epidemic that comes with it. Also, different parts about the addiction cycle. We will also give some information on how to identify if someone near you is overdosing, and we will also include information on what to expect if you go through withdrawal symptoms yourself. So let's get started. Alright, so prescription drugs and heroin actually do have a lot in common. They actually all come from the same source. Opioids, also known as opiates, and narcotics actually include common medications like oxycodone, fentanyl, demerol, methadone, morphine, codeine, hydrocodone, desmorphine, and they're just all in the same family of drugs. Now, something else that gets prescribed to deal with pain for a lot of people are drugs like Xanax and Valium, which are actually called tranquilizers and sedatives, and these are actually non-opioid pain relievers. They actually work in a completely different way from opioids, so we will not be discussing those much further in this presentation. We'll actually cover those in the next section. But opioids, most tranquilizers and sedatives are all highly addictive and habit-forming, but most of all, they are deadly. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So it all starts somewhere, right? Of course, with addiction, it all starts pretty innocently. And that's no different for opioid painkillers, really. If you or somebody that you know has ever suffered from some kind of painful experience, and this could be anything from like a sports injury to a car accident to an accident just playing around the house, or dental surgery, or intense anxiety, hunting accidents. These accidents really are very common, and whenever somebody gets hurt, they inevitably have to go to a doctor, and it's a long road to recovery. So on that road, something that tends to help people out are different types of medications. And so with surgery or other types of medical practices, these things would be extremely, excruciatingly painful if we didn't have a way to take the pain away. And so this is where opioids come in. They come in to take the pain away to help people on the road to recovery. But the problem is, because they're so addictive and habit-forming, and because, a fact of life is pain sucks, people tend to like not having to deal with pain. And so the idea is with less pain comes more pleasure. So the chronic pain will sometimes completely go away, and the body is fully healed. Now, despite the fact that the body is healed, the behavior of taking these pain relievers has not gone away. So the behavior continues. And so taking the pills just becomes a habit. and it's a habit that feels pretty good. If you've ever experienced it before, then you know. It makes you really sleepy, but also you feel really fine when, and otherwise, for whatever reason you were taking the medication, you wouldn't be feeling fine. And so eventually, most of the time a physician will take you off of that prescription. And so for the people who have become addicted, they will look for the pain reliever in any way that they can find it. And usually that's stealing from family or friends. And this is actually how 80% of heroin users started. They start with a pill addiction. So before we move forward, I just want to say again that sedatives are not opioids. They are very similar, and they are used to treat very similar problems. But sedatives actually work on the central nervous system, so they mostly focus on the brain. And sedatives are actually known as benzodiazepines and barbiturates. And it looks like I misspelled it. My mistake. But these are actually mostly prescribed for mental health disorders like anxiety, psychosis, schizophrenia. They also are used sometimes as sleep aids. And so that's why they're commonly mistaken as opioids. And I'm not going to be testing you on that, but I just want to make sure that you understand the difference. And so benzos and barbiturates are highly addictive as well, and they can be life-altering. Today they are prescribed for anxiety and sleep, like Ambien and Xanax, and they are still incredibly dangerous, especially when they are added to other depressants like alcohol. A lot of people have found themselves overdosing because they were drinking while taking the pills, and that has actually led to a lot of different deaths. And we will actually focus more on this material in our next video, which we'll be releasing in, I believe, 2 weeks. So just to remind everybody that sedatives are not opioids, despite the fact that they are also used to treat pain, and they are also highly addictive and dangerous. But they will not be a part of this presentation any further. So you can basically wipe all that from your brain. So back to the actual issue. Opioids do all come from the same thing. I said that a couple of slides ago. And that thing they come from is actually a poppy flower. And there are a lot of different varieties of poppy flower, but this actually only comes from one very particular one that grows in parts of Asia and in parts of Africa. And whenever they first really caught on to what was going on, it happened thousands of years ago, they realized that the pollen from this poppy flower had an incredible ability to completely numb pain and put people basically in a sedated state. And that became really popular, especially for different types of injuries, medical treatment, for the warrior or the soldier who had gone and gotten themselves severely injured in battle. Then opium would have been a really helpful, useful thing. But also people realized that because it was such a powerful pain reliever, that it was also highly addictive to them as well. And so opium itself actually became kind of a taboo thing. I know in parts of Asia they had these really it's kind of like a bar that you would find, and it was called an opium den. It was basically where people just went and smoked their opium and laid out and were basically useless for hours and hours on end, which is okay if they didn't have anything to do, but I mean, come on. So opium actually got a little bit more refined through the years and became what we know now as morphine. Opium does still exist. I doubt that it's as common as it used to be, but who knows? There's no real way for me to determine that. But morphine is also a very highly potent and powerful drug. And of course, with our young nation, it was the drug of choice in the two major, maybe three major wars that we've had, from the Civil War to World War I to World War II. And veterans returning from those wars are still in a recovery process. And if they're not in a recovery physically, they might still be in a recovery mentally. And so morphine became very popular for the soldier returning home from war. And this became a huge, huge problem, in the 1920s, in the 1940s, 1950s, so much so that morphine actually was no longer made available as a prescription that you could take at home. In fact, you can only be administered morphine these days while in the care of a physician. So you have to be at a hospital in order to get morphine. But they do prescribe other types of painkillers that are not as potent. And so this is actually where we see heroin. Heroin was actually invented to be less addictive than morphine, but people found a way around that. And so while morphine was more addictive, or is more addictive than heroin, they still basically have the same exact rates of addiction. But heroin just tends to be more dangerous because it's usually administered without any type of supervision. But morphine was also made into a lot of different other drugs like codeine, oxycodone, hydrocodone, and really, really powerful drugs like fentanyl. And each of these drugs has actually had their part in the opioid epidemic in one way or another. And you probably wouldn't think that a really relatively weak drug like codeine would, but that's where you'd be wrong. And if you don't believe me, well, I'll just show you. So you probably learned as a kid in one way or the other, trying to get out of chores or some kind of responsibility, that creativity isn't always a good thing. A lot of times creativity can come back and bite you in the butt. And just like with methamphetamines, which is a highly addictive stimulant, which would be the opposite of an opioid, some people look for the absolute cheapest opioid high possible. And so codeine itself is actually incredibly affordable, and it's easy to find. If you've ever had just the common cold, you've ever had a cough, and you went to a doctor, they might have prescribed codeine. And so it's really easy to get these low-grade opioids and make them something incredibly powerful. And so that's what people tend to do in meth labs for meth, but they also do it for a lesser-known drug that we'll talk about in the next slide. And so what people do is they use household items to make these drugs more powerful or more potent. And ultimately, just like you probably learned whenever you got creative and it didn't work out, sometimes these people get really creative and things go horribly wrong. So I warn you, the next images are graphic, so if you are squeamish, please look away and don't say that I didn't warn you. So enter desomorphine, or more commonly referred to as crocodile. This is a drug that's actually still available over the counter, but the people who got the most creative with it also found out ways to make it at home. And so this is actually a drug that got really popular a few years ago in Russia, the Ukraine, and the rest of Europe, and it actually found its way into America. And it actually got the rest of the world talking because of the characteristic grotesqueness that it creates. So as you can see from the pictures, at the injection sites and at the sites where it's applied, some people even smoke it, which is why you can see basically into that woman's eye cavity. The materials that are used to make desomorphine, whenever they're made at home, are highly caustic. And at the injection sites, it basically corrodes the skin. It melts the skin off of the bone. And so it's something that's incredibly inexpensive to make, and if you have all the right ingredients, It is 5 times more potent than codeine itself, but it is incredibly volatile and dangerous. So the real question is crocodile really less expensive? And I would argue it costs a lot. Hospital bills, your life. Yeah, exactly. And so we've actually had a lot of people that we've lost throughout the years to opioid addiction. And this is where I take a moment to kind of acknowledge that we have so many people in pop culture who are beloved people that have passed away because they lost their battle against their addiction. We have people like Mac Miller, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Tom Petty, Jimi Hendrix. We have more recent losses like Lil Peep, Prince, Chris Farley, and it's really sad that these people lost their lives doing something that they probably thought was harmless. Now, in some cases, with these faces that we have up here, like in the matter of Juice WRLD, who unknowingly took a fatal amount of opioids while boarding an airplane, or in the case of Heath Ledger, who actually was taking several different medications at the same time. Many of these people lost their addiction because they were either careless or combining their medications when they weren't supposed to. And so we've lost so many people, and of course this is not the full list, but I want you to just look at and acknowledge the fact that these are people that are never coming back, and they have made an incredible mark on the world as we know it today. So a quote that I actually like to bring up is a quote by a physician who said that the common misconception is that the U.S. is normal in how it handles its opioid problem. The reality is every other country in the world is actually just as good at handling their pain problems as the U.S. is, but they use a fraction of the amount of opioids that we use. And so the real problem is that we live in an overprescribed society where if people have problems, the common reaction is to just go get a pill for that. And so people tend to look for a quick solution to a long-term problem. And so the real bad guys here are actually the large pharmaceutical companies that make so much money off of these deaths. And another key player are the physicians who prescribe the medications. And so this has been something that's been building up ever since the 90s, when there was a big push to increase the amount of people that were on painkillers, because at the time they thought that they were going to be less addictive and have fewer side effects. And so since that campaign, we have realized that that was a huge mistake. So in the video that we just skipped, it actually highlights a lot of that information. So I advise anybody that is watching this presentation to go to the description below after this video and go watch that video, because they do a great job of explaining all the information. But on this slide, we actually focus on different rates of prescribed opioids as well as subsequent overdose deaths. So let's look at some of these graphs. So in chart number 1, we look at overdose deaths involving opioids by type in the US from 2000 to 2016. And so the 4 different conditions that we're really looking at are synthetic opioids like fentanyl and tramadol, heroin, natural and semi-synthetic opioids like oxycodone and hydrocodone, and methadone, which is used to treat people who are addicted to heroin. So all 4 of those together we see in the green line. And so you can see from the beginning to the end, the number of deaths has gone up more than 5 times what it used to be. And that would be at the beginning of the millennium. But in the next chart, we actually look at fentanyl alone. So from 2000 to 2015, we actually saw an increase by 400% in the number of people who died from a synthetic opioid, which is just another terrifying statistic. But in this chart, we actually look at the number of doses that people take every single day. And you can see by and large that the United States actually has well over 20,000 more people that take a prescribed opioid daily. And that's not including all of the people that are taking the drug illicitly or without a prescription. And so it just goes to show how far ahead of other nations we are. Our closest competition is Canada, and they are so far behind us that there's virtually no way that they could ever keep up. But this isn't a real game. Why would they want to try to keep up? And so in this chart, we actually look at the 3 waves of the rise in opioid overdose deaths. Wave 1 would actually be the beginning of our opioid epidemic, which is when pharmaceutical companies started to prescribe opioids. And then wave 2 would be heroin overdose deaths, which has always been pretty constant, but it really started to take off in 2010. And then wave 3 would be synthetic opioid deaths, which really spikes around 2013, 2014. Now in 2016, we actually saw about 116 people died every single day from an opioid-related drug overdose, meaning that 43,000 people died the entire year from an opioid overdose. And that had an overall economic cost of about $504 billion. And that would be in things like medical fees, funeral costs, and legal fees. So I think that someone needs to answer for all of this, and I don't think that that should be carried on the shoulders of the people who have found themselves addicted to these drugs, because ultimately it's not their fault that they got hooked on something that took their pain away. And so the real culprit, I believe, are the pharmaceutical companies. And I wouldn't be alone in that. So in this cartoon, we actually see that both pharmaceutical companies and death are prospering. Both of their rates are just going sky high. And it's a real grim way to represent it, but also there are some serious legal battles that have been seen over the past few years, and some that are still waiting to be seen. In fact, we had a few that were supposed to be seen just in the past couple of months, but because of COVID-19 pandemic, they were not able to be seen by the Supreme Court. But this is where entire states have sued pharmaceutical companies because of the amount of people who lost their lives just because pharmaceutical companies were trying to bang out a profit. And so the pharmaceutical companies make billions of dollars every single year, but the amount of money that they spend in order to produce their products is relatively inexpensive compared to the amount of profits that they make. But the real problem here is that people are profiting off of death itself. And so we have these headlines that show up every now and again where we see someone else's life has been claimed because of heroin or because of prescription drug overdose, or we hear about a friend who we grew up with who was taking their medication and something went horribly wrong and they're no longer with us. And so we have to do something about this. And if it's not educating ourselves, it's educating other people on what can happen if we stop following the guidelines given to us by our physicians and we start to take our prescriptions in vain. And it's really important that we follow those labels, or else you could end up like any of these people, and nobody wants to see that happen to you. So there are some important things to remember, especially if you or someone that you know is battling an addiction. And luckily, in Region 2 in Mississippi, we have a lot of resources that are available. Of course, you can always log online and look and try to find help for your addiction, but do what you can and call Communicare or some other free addiction and mental health organization, and they will get you the help that you deserve. We actually do have a chemical unit here in Oxford that Communicare runs, and we have Narcotics Anonymous meetings, we have Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and they are entirely free and they are an extremely supportive environment. Also, during the quarantine, I know that they're still hosting Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous meetings that are done over Zoom meeting, which has become such a big part of the quarantine experience. So if you are someone that you know is suffering from an addiction, especially with narcotics addiction, please encourage your loved ones to seek help. Of course, relapse is something that is expected in the recovery process. So if you are in the process of recovering from your addiction and you do relapse and you fall off the horse, don't give up, because the number of times that people fall off the horse and give up far outweighs the number of times where people have been successful. But being successful means that you have your own life back, and I think that that is probably one of the biggest things that is taken away from you whenever you have an addiction, and it's your freedom. So if you or someone you know is at risk of overdosing, please remember that reporting an overdose is not illegal. If you call 911 or if you call an emergency responder, they cannot arrest you because you are doing a service to someone who is in dire need of help. So someone who shows up on the scene after you have called the emergency number, especially in Oxford, I know will have what is called Narcan or naloxone, which is something that reverses the phases of overdose. And so this is something where you have to act very quickly in order for it to be successful. But as soon as the Narcan is administered, this is something that has been shown to prevent overdose. It's something that every emergency responder in Lafayette County has, as well as every police officer is equipped with naloxone. So it's important to call 911, and they will do everything that they can in order to save that person's life, and you cannot get in trouble. Now you might think to yourself, I don't know what an overdose looks like. So if you don't know what an overdose looks like, we have these really helpful infographics. So in the first infographic, we have recognizing an opioid overdose. So whenever someone is overdosing, their blood starts to constrict. So you might notice that their palms and parts of their skin start to get cold, blue, and purple. They also might become unresponsive to voice or touch. You might notice that their pupils get really, really, really tiny. Also, their heartbeat slows down, as well as their breathing, and they might appear very pale and clammy. So, if you or someone you know is experiencing any of these symptoms, then they might be having an opioid overdose. So, in that case, call 911. Also, if you are going through withdrawal, there's some important things to look at. Now, opioid withdrawal is something that takes a lot of time, and usually it takes about 1 month for your body and mind to mostly recover from the addiction. Normally, within the very first 3 hours after your last dose, you see your physical symptoms at the peak. So these would be the chills, the fever, the body aches, diarrhea, and so on. Now, within 1 week, that gets a little bit less. In 2 weeks, you start to have depression, you probably have trouble sleeping. And then after 1 month, you might still have opioid cravings and you might still have depression. And then, of course, it's entirely possible that you could continue to have depression well after the withdrawal is over. Now, if you find yourself needing some kind of medicine and you're afraid of using an opioid, there are a lot of different medicines that are available, such as NSAIDs, which would be like Advil or Aleve, that are really good and helpful at treating inflammation. There's also antidepressants that are good for what we call neuropathic pain, which is actually just nerve pain. And so antidepressants aren't only useful for treating depression. A lot of times depression is caused by neuropathic pain, but antidepressants such as Elavil or Cymbalta are really good at treating things like burning, tingling, and numbness. And then there's also anticonvulsants, which work very similarly to antidepressants, and that would be something like Neurontin. You might actually know somebody that takes Neurontin as opposed to taking an opioid. And then there are really, really useful what we call topical agents, otherwise known as lotions. And that would be things like lidocaine or brand name Lidoderm or a capsaicin ointment. Now, capsaicin is actually something that is completely natural, that is taken from peppers, and they put it into a lotion, and it's been shown to work remarkably well if you have that neuropathic pain as well. So lidocaine, capsaicin, Neurontin, Cymbalta are all very useful things to treat varying types of pain. And so it's really important to know that if you are in recovery, or if you are just trying to avoid opioids for your own personal reasons, which I totally understand, that there are options that are out there. And it really is important that you are aware of those options, and that if you speak with your physician and you let them know exactly what you do want and what you don't want, they will be able to help you. And so that actually wraps up our entire presentation for today. There will not be a part 2 because we successfully covered all of the information in this one video. And so if you're out there during quarantine, I hope that you are still maintaining a safe distance from other people, and that you're still washing your hands and trying to avoid touching your face, and of course wearing those face masks. And as society slowly starts to reintegrate, please be prepared to continue to do those safe preventative practices. So from all of us here at Oxford Communicare for Region 2, Mississippi, we hope that you are out there being safe, and that you are enjoying and prospering and thriving in your quarantine atmosphere. We hope that you enjoyed this video, and of course, take care.